Okay, so the subject I'm going to cover in this video is a very controversial one, but I try to be very candid in these videos and I'm not taboo about anything. What I mean by that is political correctness does not exist in my channel. I talk about issues I feel need to be spoken about. So nothing is off limits. And this is something I think needs to be discussed a bit more. And because it's so easy to be misunderstood in this subject, I would ask that you listen very carefully to every word I say. That's all I ask. If at the end you still disagree, fine, but at least listen carefully to what I say and certainly don't misquote me. So the subject I want to speak about is black racism. Racism from black people. Now, I've just watched a video by a guy called Rob on the Streets, whereby he was walking around street somewhere, American City, I'm not sure if it was New York or somewhere else, but asking a variety of people if black people could be racist. I think the video could have been a lot more wide-reaching. He only really interviewed about 3 or 4 guys. He's a black guy, and he interviewed a few black people about whether or not black people, specifically I assume he means African Americans in this context, can be racist. Most of the responses were sort of like, yeah, they can. Well, I say most of the responses, like I said, it wasn't really that far reaching. But one that caught my attention was an older black man, I guess probably in his 60s, who openly said, without laughing, without trying to make any sort of joke, that he hates all things white. And there's no such thing as a good white person, because there's no such thing as a good devil or something along those lines. I'll put a link to the video, you can check out for yourself. What's interesting about this is he wasn't trying to be funny, he was being deadly serious. So this is a guy that obviously goes through his entire life trying to avoid a certain race of people. Now, there's a few disclaimers I'd like to make. As you can tell by my accent, I'm not American. And this still, in my view, remains a deeply divisive issue in America. America may have its first mixed race president, and technically Obama is mixed race. But, and by the way, I've also seen a new film that's come out which looks quite intriguing. I think it's called Dear White People, something like that. It's sort of a political satire. Should be interesting, and I guess it'll open up a debate, which is probably a good thing, or might be, depending what way it goes. But for my 50 cents on this, I think absolutely black people can be racist. Of course they can. I think any human being is capable of racism. Now, what I've noticed is that the general argument against black people being racist comes from 2 types of people, either white liberals or black supremacists. They're the 2 types of people who tend to argue that black racism doesn't exist. From a white liberal perspective, it is extreme political correctness, and I imagine a sort of guilty conscience, or the notion that because the history of African Americans was so painful and so difficult and so tinged with extreme racism, then their descendants therefore have this little bubble around them where they're immune from any critique of being racist themselves. In other words, if someone's great-great-grandfather was lynched in the Deep South or was a slave, that person therefore is basically given the green light to be as racist as they want, and they're never going to be accused of racism as, hey, they're black, therefore their ancestors suffered at one point. Now, I think this is an absurd way of thinking. If we wanted to get really, really go down those lines, that line of thinking, then you could argue that almost anyone in the world could have a grievance against almost anyone else based on their ancestors' suffering. I mean, hell, I'm British, right? If I wanted to go down those lines, I could have an anti-Italian prejudice because the Roman Empire enslaved ancient Britons. Now granted it was much further back, but the point is there has to be a cut-off point here where it just gets utterly absurd. It's like a constant blame game, and unfortunately within the United States I do notice this is still a very polarizing subject. Unfortunately, race is still always brought up whenever there's a dispute between people, and it really wears me down. I think this is sad that America today is still, and I'm quoting America because it is a very profound issue there. I'm not saying it doesn't exist in other countries, but I have seen so many debates online where it's just one racist attacking another racist, and it's a constant back and forth thing, and it is so nauseating. Look, in the end of the day, if you're judging someone based on their skin pigmentation, you are by definition a racist. Now, white liberals who claim that reverse racism doesn't exist, or black supremacists who say that's the case, I would agree with them. Reverse racism doesn't exist. You know why? Because it's plain old racism. That's what it is. The idea that, say for the sake of argument, right, I got called names because of my skin colour, or I got a hard time in a black neighbourhood because of my skin colour. Now, I've never been in that situation, but this is just a scenario, right? How could anyone rationally say that that's not an example of racism? Of course it is. And some people might say, well, why are you just focusing on black racism? Why not Asian racism, or Hispanic racism, or white racism for the matter? The reason I focus on this is because, for this specific video, is because I have noticed there is a huge amount of denial within the black community. I certainly don't think that I've known many black people who have been very reasonable and civil and friendly towards myself, so it's not a case that all black people are racist, of course not. But I would like to see a lot more condemnation from black people condemning black racists and saying, look, this is not progressive. You're not being any better than white racists by having that sort of attitude. To be fair, I have seen one or two videos like that. I saw a video a while back where a guy was denouncing black racists in a very vocal way. In fact, he made an interesting point. He was a black guy, and he was specifically condemning racist black women who hate white women who happen to be with black men. His point was, A, it's none of their damn business, and B, well, check it out yourself. I'm afraid that this was a while back. I don't have a link for that particular video. I wish I did, because it was a very good video. In fact, if I find it again, I'll try and put a link into this. But I get extremely frustrated with the argument that just because black people were traditionally the victims of extreme racism, some black people aren't guilty of racism themselves. If you judge an entire ethnic group by their skin pigmentation, you are by definition a racist. If you've had a bad experience with, say for example, white racists or Asian racists, racism, and you then have a problem with those people that persecuted you or harassed you or gave you a hard time, that's entirely human. It's entirely understandable that you would hate those people. But to then transcend that into hating all white people or all Asian people or all Hispanic people, and this applies to any group, racism within any group, just that I would say the same thing to white people who hate all black people because they might have been the victim of a black gang. It's just unfortunately, it's sad that in this day and age there's still people who have that world outlook whereby they judge people solely on skin pigmentation. I find it very nauseating. The only reason I'm specifically focusing on black racists in this video is because I have noticed that there is widespread denial of the problem. And it is a problem. There is black racism out there. Now no one disputes that there are white racists, no one. But there are a lot of people who dispute that there are black racists. And yet there blatantly is. One man in the video made a quite interesting answer. He said, yeah, it is a problem, even I'm racist sometimes. And he sort of sounded like he wasn't particularly proud of it, but he said that sometimes at a certain moment people I think the point he was trying to make was people don't think clearly, and it's a way of expressing things. But I just don't understand someone who could go through life, go through the world, avoiding or hating another race. And just a point about past prejudices and the past history of racism. Some people come up with the absurd argument, oh, the white suppressed us in the past, so we can have a right to be racist today. Well, one counter to that, how about those white people who actively support the civil rights movement, sometimes facing a lot of personal problems for doing so, because they were alienated among white racist communities. So I think taking that sort of mentality is an insult to them and the efforts that they made. I mean, it's just an absolutely insane way of looking at the world. And I think if Martin Luther King was alive today, he would have a big problem with black racism. And another point, there's a very big problem with black racism against other black people. And what I mean by that is there's a sort of notion of what it means to be a true black person. I came across a website called Madame Noir, and the editor of that was having a go at black celebrities, especially black women who don't regard themselves as African American. Now, surely it's their right to identify themselves whatever way they want. They're generally seen as black celebrities, but they don't personally call themselves that. Whatever you think about that, surely it's their right. Another example, Muhammad Ali, famous boxer. One thing I don't respect about Ali was in the 70s, he shamefully showed an attitude to probably his most famous rival, Joe Frazier, that was despicable. He turned the black community against Joe Frazier by calling him an Uncle Tom, by calling him a stooge of the white establishment and this sort of thing, simply because Frazier had the title. Frazier wasn't a stooge of the white establishment, whatever that means. He certainly wasn't an Uncle Tom, so it was utterly shameful what Ali done. And it's only years later that he expressed any sort of regret for it, but even then it was half-heartedly, and he sort of said it was only to hype up fights. But he made life very difficult for Frazier in those years when Frazier held the World Heavyweight Championship in the early 70s, at the time when Ali was stripped of his title for refusing the draft, late 60s, early 70s. And yet Frazier had helped Ali by giving him money and so on to help fight the draft charge, and that's how Ali thanked him. That's just an example of black on black racism. So there's a lot of issues that I think really need to be discussed here. And just for the record, I hate racism of all kinds, but anyone that thinks that I'm going to apologise or feel shame or feel inferior because of something that is beyond my control is rubbish. I'm not proud of being white. I'm not ashamed of being white. Being white, actually, being peach, because I'm not actually white. No human being is white, as someone rightly pointed out. But it's something that's beyond my control. Likewise, I can understand to a certain extent black pride, in the sense of pride that black people were strong enough to overcome a very painful history. I can understand that, but what I don't accept is when it is then used to an extent of black superiority. So in that sense I differentiate between black pride in the sense of being proud of brave black people who stood up against that, and black superiority, or black supremacy, which is just racism. That's what it is. If you're a black person and you think that you're superior to me because of something that neither you or I can help, you're an idiot. You're also a racist. And if you really hold that mentality, then say it to a white person's face, say it to an Asian person's face, but sometimes it also is against Asians. And the point I'm trying to make here is that racism is racism is racism. There's no reverse racism. And no one can hide behind their race and say, oh, because we once suffered, it's okay for me to have a bullshit attitude to others. If you go throughout life with that attitude, you're going to find yourself pretty isolated. So just in conclusion, of course there are black racists out there. And I do wish more members of the black community of, whether it be African Americans or whatever the black community, I know that's an abstract term, but I would like to see more condemnation and recognition that it does exist. Because I, as a white guy, am sickened by white racism, or any racism. So once again, racism is racism is racism. It's that simple.